The galaxy had not known peace for centuries. War had been the default state, empires rising and falling in a cycle of conquest, betrayal, and ruin. But after the cataclysmic conflict known as the Last Fire War, when entire star systems were burned to ash, something changed. The survivors realized that no victory was worth extinction. From the ashes rose the Pax Concordia, a treaty enforced by a multi-species governing body known as the Council of Sapient Species, or INSPIRE. A massive station floating between three major trade routes became neutral ground, touchable by fleets shielded by law, and surrounded by a graveyard of ruined warships left in orbit as a grim reminder of what awaited failure. Among the many powers represented on the Council's Arcathea, Drovan Syndicate, Chirix Hive, Orville clans, and dozens more, was a relatively recent addition, Earth, representing humanity. Humans had joined the galactic stage, not long before the Last Fire War, at first underestimated as primitive Deathworlders. Earth gained swift and brutal notoriety after the siege of Arathis Prime, where a single Terran fleet under Captain Ward held off 6 combined fleets for 3 weeks using only guerrilla tactics, misdirection, and surgical strikes. The galaxy learned then that humanity did not rely on superior technology. It relied on resolve. After that, Earth was invited to the peace table not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a necessity. Everyone knew what humans could do when cornered. That was why, when Earth sent Ambassador Celine Ward to the Council, no one objected. In fact, most welcomed it. She was the daughter of the war hero from Arathis Prime, trained in both diplomacy and military doctrine. Fluent in 13 galactic languages, a master strategist, and a stoic to her core. But once she arrived, she did nothing. For 5 years, Celine Ward sat in her assigned chair in the council chamber. She listened, but she never raised her voice, never voted, never responded to provocations. Other delegates, some of them hundreds of years old, called her the ghost of Arathis. Rumors swirled that she wasn't even human, that she was a synthetic intelligence. Or worse, a sleeper weapon programmed to activate only if the treaty failed. Her silence spoke louder than any words. The galaxy feared Terran action precisely because humans didn't posture. They didn't waste words. If Earth moved, it was because it had already calculated the cost and chosen violence. So as long as Celine remained seated, silent, and still, the Council could breathe easy. Her stillness was the shield that protected the illusion of galactic peace. There were occasional incidents, the Drovan border skirmishes, the Chirix genetic experiments on non-consenting species, even the Zarkathes, quiet funding of mercenaries in the Kithram uprising. But every time, Earth stayed out of it. Celine never responded. Her silence became routine, and the Council grew comfortable. Some mistook her restraint for weakness. Others believed Earth had grown soft. The younger delegates even started to mock humanity behind closed doors. But the veterans, the ones who had witnessed the firestorms unleashed by the Terran legions, never laughed. They knew that Earth didn't forget. It waited then. On the 1829th day of the Pax Concordia, a new proposal was introduced. The Zarkathi, Dominion wealthy, cold-blooded, and infamous for their diplomatic cunning, suggested a resource reallocation protocol that would effectively strip mining rights from the Hellion Belt. A region under Terran protection, the Hellions were a fragile people, just a few generations out of extinction. Humanity had nursed them back to health, provided them medicine, ships, even language. Now, Zarkathi wanted to cut them off. The proposal passed preliminary vote with ease. The Hellion representative protested, trembling with outrage. The Zarkathi smirked. Others rolled their eyes. They believed Earth would remain silent. After all, Celine had never once voted, never once stood, never even cleared her throat. But this time, something changed. Celine's fingers twitched. It was the smallest motion, but across the chamber, heads turned. A hush fell. Her hand curled into a slow, deliberate fist and rested on the table. And then, after 5 years of stillness, she stood up. No one breathed. No one spoke, because every soul in that room was from warrior caste to merchant diplomat, understood the same chilling truth. Peace had lasted only as long as she had remained seated. And now, something far older than fear stirred in their bones, something human. The chamber of the Council of Sapient. Species was designed to withstand the weight of 1,000 cultures. Its architecture, a blend of styles meant to symbolize unity. But on the day Celine Ward stood, no architectural illusion could shield the council from the raw tension. Now vibrating through the air like the hum before a storm, the proposal had been simple on paper. The Zarkathi Dominion, known for ruthless diplomacy masked by polished civility, had offered a resource stabilization agreement. What they truly wanted, however, was domination of the Helion Belta mineral-rich region that had only recently recovered from near genocide. The Hellions were under the Terran Accord, which meant they fell under Earth's protection. But the Zarkathi didn't fear Earth anymore. 5 years of silence had dulled their caution. Selena's stillness had convinced them that humans were content to observe, to retreat from influence. Their mistake wasn't just arrogance. It was a misreading of humanity's deepest principle. Earth didn't interfere unless it had to. But when it did, it never half-measured. The vote had passed with minor resistance. The Hellion delegate, a slender figure with bioluminescent skin, had stood in desperate protest. His voice cracked with fury, grief, and terror. But few had cared. Minor species, especially those seen as Terran protégés, were often brushed aside in galactic politics. In the minds of the Council, the Helions were pawns, not players. And then Celine moved. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't shout, didn't slam her fist. She simply stood. But for the delegates who had survived the last fire war, the memory of Terran shock troops, of orbital kinetic strikes, of the burning of Arothis Prime, returned in an instant. For them, Celine's rise wasn't just a gesture. It was the beginning of a countdown. All eyes locked on her. Even the Zarkathi Prime Minister, Barkzella, serpent-like diplomat, who had smirked just minutes before froze, his facial frills fluttering in unconscious fear. And then Celine spoke. Just 8 words. But the chamber would remember them forever. You do not get to decide who matters. The weight of her voice wasn't in its volume, but in its certainty. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even a threat. It was a correction. As if she were a teacher scolding a child for getting a moral question wrong. It tunkled resolute carried. Centuries of Terran pain, pride, promise. The chamber descended into chaos. Some delegates shouted procedural violations. Others called for a revote or accused Celine of inciting conflict. The Hellion delegate sat down, stunned, his wide eyes fixed on her with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. The Zarkathi attempted to regain composure. Farksel stood, raising his many-fingered hand. With respect, Ambassador Ward, the matter has passed by legal vote. Your intervention while moving sets a dangerous precedent for galactic order. Celine turned to him slowly. She didn't blink. Then, let me show you the alternative to order. Without waiting for approval, she transmitted a command through her wrist dash link, high above Orin Spire. The TSS Veilbreaker, a Terran diplomatic vessel that had remained parked and unremarkable for years, came to life. It moved on toward the spire, but toward the Helion belt. Its signal was clear. The protection Earth had once extended in silence was now official, but more disturbing was the ripple that followed. Within seconds, Allied ships, sun-affiliated war cruisers from scattered colonies, old Earth-built Helion skirmishers, even vessels with no official registry, began to break formation and align behind the Veilbreaker's trajectory. Earth hadn't just sent a warship, it had awoken a network. The council chamber quieted again. This time not in fear, but in realization. Earth had not gone quiet out of disinterest. It had been watching, recording, waiting. And now, with just one human rising from a chair, a sleeping coalition of Terran-aligned forces was activating across multiple systems. Celine said nothing more. She didn't need to. The message was already spreading across the galaxy. Humanity has stood. The shock wasn't just military, it was philosophical. Earth wasn't demanding territory or wealth. It was defending a small, recovering species no one else valued. That terrified the Council more than any weapon ever could. Because what kind of power fights not for gain, but for principle? What kind of species unleashes fleets, not for conquest, but for a single sentence? The kind that doesn't bluff. Kind that ends wars with conviction. And for the first time in a generation, the Council understood the truth they'd willfully forgotten. Humanity did not need to shout. It only needed to move. The atmosphere inside the Council chamber was electric, charged, like the moment before lightning touches ground. All because of one human, one sentence. And one shift in posture that had shattered 5 years of uneasy peace. Celine Ward, Earth's long silent ambassador, had finally spoken. You do not get to decide who matters. Those 8 words, calm and precise, weren't spoken in rage or desperation. They were offered like a facta universal truth that struck harder than any weapon. No shouting, no threats. Just a clear line that had been drawn in the sand, and a signal that Earth, the quiet apex predator of the Council, had opened its eyes. Celine did not raise her voice again. She didn't have to. The message she sent moments later to her vessel, the TSS Veilbreaker, was simple: prepare for immediate deployment to the Helion Belt. The ship, a Terran, diplomatic cruiser only in name, was already infamous. Beneath its ambassadorial insignia lay a monster of engineering, stealth capabilities, cannons, drone wings, and gravitic countermeasures. It had never fired a shot in the Council's presence, but now it had moved. Worse still, others followed. Vessels bearing Terran manufacturing codes suddenly broke off from trade routes and began flocking toward Helion space. Some were Terran military, yes, but many were civilians, independent captains and colonists, answering an unspoken call. Old freighters, refitted ore haulers, even pleasure cruisers, suddenly reactivating ancient combat subroutines, converting whole space to supply caches. It was a sight that baffled the Council, because no other species did this. No other empire could summon such unified defiance without a formal order. Without a central command, without coercion, Celine hadn't mobilized a fleet. She had reminded Earth who it was. The Council chamber erupted. Members accused Earth of violating peace accords. The Zarkothi Dominion's representative Vark Zell demanded Celine be censured or replaced. He argued that the Terran action was disproportionate, reckless, destabilizing. Celine met his protest with a calm gaze. Then she answered not to him, but to all of them. You mistake silence for weakness. You mistake patience for permission. And now you learn we do not abandon our own. The truth in her words hit harder than kinetic rounds. The Terran legacy in the galaxy wasn't just one of warfare, it was one of relentless loyalty. Earth didn't start most wars, but when it ended them, it did so completely. This was the same Earth that had pulled the Durari from extinction after a stellar collapse. The same Earth that had sacrificed to colonies to save a Vroskian arc ship adrift in the void. Humans didn't walk away from those they called friends, and the Helions were more than friends. They were under Earth's shield. That's when the whispers began, even among Earth's rivals. Not fear respect, cautious respect. The Erval Warklins, historically neutral, released a statement of non-interference, a veiled signal of passive support. The Ilari scholars praised Earth's moral imperative. Even the Korathi syndicate, smugglers and profiteers, began rerouting black market goods to the Helions for free. Because when Earth stood up for someone, the galaxy took notice. Meanwhile, in Helion space, the effects were already unfolding. The Veilbreaker didn't fire a shot. It didn't need to. Its arrival alone caused Zarkothi's survey ships to withdraw. Their mercenaries, left without orbital support, surrendered or fled. Terran drones dropped food and medical kits instead of bombs. Human marines set up shield domes and dug emergency wells for Helion villages. Earth had come not as conqueror but as protector, and that terrified the Council even more. Because this wasn't war for resources, expansion, retaliation. This was justice, precise, uncompromising. Back in the chamber, Celine remained standing. She didn't call for retribution. She didn't ask for reparations or revenge. All she asked was this: rescind the vote, recognize Hellion sovereignty, or watch the galaxy redraw itself without you. No? It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, delivered with terrifying serenity. The council hesitated. Some wanted to challenge Earth. But deep down, they knew if they pushed further, Celine wouldn't be the only one standing. Earth itself would rise, and when it did, no super weapon or fleet would match the will behind it, because humanity's most dangerous weapon wasn't its tech, its armies, or even its warships. It was its conviction. And now that conviction had a voice again. Word of Celine Ward's stand spread like plasma fire across the stars. The Council of Sapient Species had been the galactic seat of law, diplomacy, and restraint for nearly 6 decades. It was a place where declarations of war were replaced by sanctions, where empires competed with trade agreements instead of orbital strikes. But in one moment, 8 words and 1 human ambassador standing, the entire system teetered on the edge, and the galaxy responded at first. There was confusion. How could a single human ambassador cause such chaos? But as fleets began to mobilize, not at Earth's command, but of their own volition, the shock set in. This wasn't just a diplomatic incident. It was a revelation of Earth's true strength. Not domination through fear, but loyalty through choice. The TSS Veilbreaker's arrival in Hellion space was followed by a ripple effect across human-allied systems. Mining outposts, agricultural worlds, research stations, even civilian freighters with no formal military ties routed themselves toward Hellion territory. It was as if Earth had flipped a silent switch, and entire sectors lit up in response. Ships of every size and class joined the effort. The Crimson Oath, a Terran mercenary corvette turned humanitarian ship. The Providence's Mercy, a medical cruiser funded by Earth's diaspora. Even old colony-run salvagers, barely spaceworthy, began hauling supplies into Hellion territory. The galaxy hadn't just underestimated Earth's military, it had forgotten Earth's community. That was the true terror. Earth didn't act as an empire, it acted as a family. Species united not by blood, but by principle. When one of their own, or even one under their protection, was threatened, the humans moved. They moved fast, and they moved together. The council scrambled to contain the fallout. Emergency sessions were called. Attempts were made to downplay Celine Ward's actions as a rogue gesture. But even as they debated her legitimacy, Earth's quiet strategy was already reshaping the balance of power. In the Zarkothi Dominion, there was panic. They had pushed too far, too quickly, had mistaken Earth's silence for absence. Now, their trade routes were collapsing. Hellion allies, newly fortified by Terran shipments, began reclaiming lost territory without firing a single plasma round. Zarkothi patrols found themselves boxed in by a wall of Earth-aligned ships that refused to blink. The Dominion's High Council debated launching a limited strike, something to test Earth's resolve. But cooler minds prevailed. Images from Hellion space showed something they could not ignore. Terran ships landing with medical aid, engineers repairing infrastructure, children laughing under the protection of Terran combat suits. How do you declare war on that? Even Earth's old enemies hesitated. The Drovan Syndicate, once bitter rivals of Terran expansion, issued a neutral statement. But privately, they began reassigning their fleets away from Terran zones. The Chirix Hive, notorious for its cold pragmatism, dispatched observers to Hellion space. It was curious as to how Earth had turned war logistics into a campaign of hope. The real shift ever came from the smaller powers, the neglected, the colonized, the ones who had always sat at the Council's periphery. Suddenly, they saw a different path, a protector that didn't demand obedience, only respect. One by one, independent systems began flying banners marked with Earth's simple motto, "We stand when others fall." Less than 2 cycles, Earth's diplomatic network exploded. Hellion support tripled. Karen miners pledged rare metals to the Terran Alliance. The Virali Swarm offered Hypersilk as tribute, not in surrender, but in solidarity. Earth hadn't won a war, it had won hearts. Back in the council, the tone changed. Delegates who had mocked Celine Ward now avoided her gaze. Even Varkzel, the Zarkothi diplomat who had smugly pushed the Hellion Treaty, found himself isolated. Proposals to sanction Earth quietly died on the floor. The Council wasn't just afraid of Earth's weapons, it feared Earth's example, because if one human standing up could shift the tide of power, what happened if humanity stood up together? In the end, the Zarkothi were forced to rescind the treaty. It's not by war, not by coercion, but by public pressure. Celine didn't demand apologies. She didn't ask for vengeance. She only ensured that the Hellions were safe, supplied, and respected. Then, she sat down, and once again the chamber fell into silence. But it was a different silence now, not of dismissal, not of mockery, but of deference. The galaxy had learned a lesson it would never forget. Earth's true strength was never just its firepower. It was its unshakable resolve. And when that resolve moved, empires did not resist. They recalculated. The galaxy would never be the same. In the weeks following, Celine Ward's stand at the council. Star systems across known space reoriented themselves, not just politically, but philosophically. The balance of power hadn't shifted with weapons or fleets, but with a single decision. A quiet human had stood, spoken truth, and redefined the meaning of peace. The Zarkothi Dominion, once proud and domineering, found itself diplomatically isolated. Their revoked treaty with the Hellions wasn't just a loss of resources. It was a public admission of overreach. The Dominion had tested Earth's resolve and been met not with threats, but with coordinated, overwhelming, righteous response. But it didn't end with the Hellion Belt. What began as a Terran defense of one small ally soon became a blueprint for others. The Council's peripheral members, long ignored, exploited, or dismissed it, now saw another option besides silence or surrender. They saw Earth. And more importantly, they saw Celine Ward. She had become a symbol. It's not of war, but of moral authority. Her decision to rise, her refusal to let smaller voices be trampled, had shaken a stagnant system to its core. Even her silence afterward spoke volumes, because Celine hadn't taken power. She hadn't demanded leadership. She hadn't declared herself a savior. After the Hellion crisis was resolved, she returned to her seat, sat down, and resumed her quiet watch over the council. That act alone left ripples in a galactic theater, where every diplomat jostled for visibility, where status was measured in spectacle. Celine's restraint was as disarming as her resolve. She wasn't posturing, she was guarding, waiting, ready to stand again if needed. The council reassembled weeks later to discuss new protocols measures aimed at preventing another crisis. But everyone in the chamber knew the truth. There would be no more careless bullying of Earth's allies, no more treaties made in the shadows. The price of arrogance had been made clear. Earth had redrawn the map, not by conquest, but by choice. One of the most notable shifts came from the minor factions. Worlds like the Varan Commune, previously neutral, now sought closer ties with Terran humanitarian organizations. The Surian Federation, long plagued by internal conflict, invited Terran peacekeepers for mediation. Even the Kormal tribes, once fiercely independent, began sharing data with Earth's scientific network. The Terran Accord grew not by expansion, but by invitation. What baffled and frightened Earth's rivals most wasn't how powerful the humans were, but how carefully they chose to use that power. In a galaxy defined by domination, Earth stood apart, not because it couldn't conquer, but because it didn't want to. And that, paradoxically, made them more dangerous than any empire. The Zarkothi, though humiliated, weren't foolish. They understood this new balance. Their propaganda shifted. Rather than inciting hostility toward Earth, they began publicly emphasizing mutual respect and shared stewardship. Behind closed doors, they reevaluated every trade route and border policy involving the Terran sphere of influence. The Council, once the centerpiece of galactic diplomacy, adapted as well. Resolutions that once passed through corruption and intimidation now faced scrutiny. Selena's silent gaze had become a kind of moral compass, not official, not codified, but ever-present. She never had to raise her voice again. She had taught the galaxy that peace is not just the absence of war, it is the presence of justice. Earth's enemies had once believed the humans were unpredictable, dangerous, perhaps even irrational. But now they saw the truth. Earth was deliberate. Earth was measured, and Earth remembered everything. Those memories of betrayal, of loyalty, of sacrifice guided every Terran decision. The galaxy had learned that humans didn't act from pride or profit. They acted when it mattered. When they did, they committed fully. Years later, scholars would call it the Veil-Breaker Doctrina, diplomatic philosophy of restrained power, strategic compassion, and unbreakable defense. It would be studied, feared, admired, but none could replicate it, because it didn't come from a ship or a fleet. It came from a woman who stood when no one else would, and then sat back down, not to surrender but to watch. To wait, not as a warning, as a promise that peace would endure. So long as the powerful remembered, you do not get to decide who matters, and if they ever forgot, humanity would remind them.